That was Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall, and this is Gnostic Media Research and Publishing's podcast number 68, Another Brick in the Wall, Part 1. I'm your host, Jan Irvin. We ask some important questions. Is there a relationship between eugenics, mind control, and compulsory education? Is compulsory education good for anyone? And what are the negative effects of our modern education system? Where did our education system originate, and by whom? What's happened to our educational system since the 1800s? Has there been an intentional effort by the elites and government to dumb us down? What do compulsory education and Pavlov's dogs have in common? Are children better off working or being in school? To answer these questions, we first have to reach the foundation of our education system. Continuing our education on the trivium method, this is one of the most important and powerful interviews to date, and my guest for this week and next is John Taylor Gatto, probably the most famous school teacher in the world, and he was New York State's Teacher of the Year when he quit on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal in 1991. John Taylor Gatto climaxed his teaching career as New York State Teacher of the Year after being named New York City Teacher of the Year on 3 occasions. He quit teaching on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal in 1991 while still New York State Teacher of the Year, claiming that he was no longer willing to hurt children. Later that year, he was the subject of a show at Carnegie Hall called An Evening with John Taylor Gatto, which launched a career of public speaking in the area of school reform, which has taken Gatto over 1.5 million miles in all 50 states and 7 foreign countries. In 1992, he was named Secretary of Education in the Libertarian Party's shadow cabinet, and he has been included in Who's Who in America from 1996 on. In 1997, he was given the Alexis de Tocqueville Award for his contributions to the cause of liberty and was named to the Board of Advisors of the National TV Turn-Off Week. His books include Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, 1992, The Exhausted School, 1993, A Different Kind of Teacher, 2000, and Underground History of American Education, 2001, and his most recent book is Weapons of Mass Instruction. You can go to his website at www.johntaylorgatto.com. And since I've done about 67 intros before today's show that go into where you can buy books and things like that and how to support the Gnostic Media podcast, I'm going to skip all the bullshit today and get straight into our education with John Taylor Gatto. What you're about to hear will tear your heart out. You're about to see how the entire mind control system was put into place and how it works. Gnostic Media is not responsible for your anger, but we do encourage you to take immediate action by taking an active role in your community, PTA organizations, and by all means, share this information with everyone you know, especially parents of school children. The future depends on it. And if you have your children in compulsory education, go and get them out right now and begin homeschooling today. Because if you want to beat the New World Order and these psychotic elitists, it's the only way. And really, what are you waiting for? This is an MP3. Take it with you, and you'll need it to share it with them anyway. The views expressed by the authors and guests of this program are their own and are not necessarily those held by myself or Gnostic Media. If you would like to visit the Gnostic Media website, go to www.gnosticmedia.com. That's GNOSTIC media.com. You can contact me directly at contact@gnosticmedia.com. Thanks for listening, and thank you for your support. John, welcome to Gnostic Media's podcast. How are you today?
I'm as good as being 75 allows me to be, so we're pretty much okay.
Well, that's I suppose that's a good age to be at. That means you've got lots of wisdom. Is that correct?
No comment. I'll let your listeners decide.
All right. Well, you know, I've read a couple of your books, and I would have to say that it shines in your work. Why don't you start out by telling us who is John Taylor Gatto?
Okay, I was born in western Pennsylvania in a small coal mining steelworking town about 40 miles from Pittsburgh. The name is Monongahela, and it was quite an interesting place to grow up during World War II. The sky was always red or black, red with flames at night and black with soot in the day. The people were genuinely a melting pot community. The population was 4,400, and there were 48 different religious denominations in town, which I only as an old fellow have come to see made a lot of nervous times for ministers, etc. Anyway, the town taught me independence, self-reliance, critical thinking. So many things just came from being in a genuine community where people looked out for one another in a kind of a tough-minded way. When I came to New York City, and it had the reputation of being a melting pot, and I quickly saw that everyone in the city was ghettoized pretty strictly, and the schools ghettoized them further. I was a little bit taken aback, and after a while I became very angry about it, because I had grown through my teen years in a real community. I don't know how many of those are left in the United States. So I went to two Ivy League colleges, first Cornell and then Columbia. And as I told an audience at Geneva College in western Pennsylvania a few days ago, I cannot remember a single thing I learned very expensively at those two colleges. And when I came out of college, I went into the advertising business as a copywriter, but it seemed to be, well, dull is the right word. I said, I can't believe, now I'm 22 or whatever. I said, I can't believe people do this all their life, and they sit around arguing about adjectives or adverbs. So my roommate was a chef who opened a restaurant. He also had a teaching degree without a photo ID on it, and he threw it into the drawer after teaching one day, and he said, you'd have to be a lunatic to make your money that way. Then he went to the Virgin Islands and opened a swell restaurant called the Club Comanche. And when I was in between advertising jobs, it occurred to me that I could take his license and substitute teach, which I did, and that changed my life, because the first or second assignment I got up in Harlem was teaching Spanish classes, and I probably have 90 words of Spanish, but I can tell time. So I asked the classes as they come in whether they knew how to tell time. None did, and I was able to fill 40 minutes, although I had to stretch things, then it takes about 15, teaching them how to tell time. The third class I met that day brought with it the principal, a white lady with a face that had turned dark purple. She was so angry. She took me out in the hall and asked what I was doing. I said, I'm teaching them how to tell time. She said, that is the entire curriculum for the month of June. How will I explain this to the regular teacher when she came back? And I didn't think I heard correctly. I said, no, it only takes 15 minutes to tell time. It can't be the whole curriculum for the month of June. Her last words to me were, you will never be hired at this school again. which sort of upset me a little, but since there were hundreds and hundreds of schools, then they all needed substitutes. It didn't put me off my feed. And the next school I went to, I was given remedial reading for, I think, 9-year-olds. And before the class started, a little girl named Milagros came up to me and said, "I don't belong in this class. I can read anything." And I said, "No, dear." I said, "This is all done scientifically, etc., etc." Well, Milagros grabs a huge book from the teacher's desk, readings, and she said, "Open it anywhere and I'll show you." So I opened it at random to The Devil and Daniel Webster, a 19th century story written in 200-word-long sentences with a really obscure vocabulary. And she did. She read it flawlessly. So I said, "Well, we make mistakes too, Milagros. I'll speak to the principal at lunch hour and we'll get you moved." But when I spoke to the principal at lunch hour, her face turned a deep shade of purple, and she said, "I am not used to taking advice from substitute teachers, and furthermore, Mr. Gatto, you are extremely innocent. These children will memorize a story to make it appear that they can read." So, good God. Of course, I opened the book at random, so she would have had to memorize the entire reader. But nevertheless, even memorizing The Devil and Daniel Webster was far beyond anything I personally could have done. So anyway, the lady said she'd come in after school and show me. And then she said, "And you will never be hired in this school again." So she comes in after school. Milagros can read anything, held upside down. The woman gets angrier and angrier instead of delighted, and repeats, "You'll never be." She said, "Milagros, you will be moved on Monday. You can go now." And then when Milagros was gone, she said, "You will never be hired again." Well, that was the beginning of 30 years in the classroom. I said to my wife, "I'm just going to teach long enough to see how far I can push these kids who are supposed to be terminally stupid, you know." And the truth is, after 30 years, I never reached the bottom of that well. So, when the New York State Teacher of the Year competition came along, somebody put my name up because I had evolved a kind of classroom program that didn't take place in the classroom. I used all New York City as a text. I pitched the lessons for 13-year-olds on exactly the level that I had learned at Cornell and Columbia, and my kids began winning enormous strings of prizes reserved for students in special high schools, etc. So the first time my name went up, I was named first runner-up state teacher of the year, but I was also named New York City Teacher of the Year. And the second time my name went up, I was named New York State Teacher of the Year. Well, the phone rang, and I began to get invitations around the country, and people flew in to look at my class, which didn't make me very happy because I had to hide what I was actually doing. So finally, I resigned on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, saying I wasn't prepared to hurt children anymore, and the phone rang, and it was the vice president, not the president, but I did go to the White House, and I spoke before the vice president, then in the old Senate office building.
Which vice president was that?
That was the guy who couldn't spell potato.
Ah,
Nice fellow.
Good old Dan Quayle.
It was Dan Quayle. And then I spoke before the New American Schools Committee in the old Senate office building. Came back to New York and got a call from NASA Goddard Space Center. This is really bringing a certain smile to I lived. I said, "Are you sure you have the right number?" I spent my life talking to 13-year-olds. Well, they wanted me to come back to Washington, to Beltsville, and speak before the engineering colloquium. So when I was absolutely certain they wanted me to come down, I went down, spoke to the engineering colloquium, got back to New York City, and there was an invitation from, let me see, it was from the Colorado Librarians Association. There was also one from the Fluid Controls Institute of Philadelphia. By this time I was having a good old time. My wife and I had decided we have a 125-acre farm in upstate New York, and we were going to be garlic farmers. But I said, these will peter out when the Wall Street Journal article does, and that was 30 years ago. Or no, it was 20 years ago. And last year I was the keynote speaker for the South Korean National Education Convention in 10 Australian cities for the first national homeschooling convention in Australia. I consulted with the Colombian government in Bogota and almost got kidnapped. and I spoke in Budapest, Hungary, Amsterdam, Holland, and twice in London, as well as in all the American states. So you can see that at 75, I don't have all that much time left to be a garlic farmer, but I still hope.
Well, that's great. How did you almost get kidnapped in Colombia?
Well, I went there with some big shot from the Gatto Institute. Went down there and they put us up at the International Hotel, which is a really fine place down there, and surrounded by mountains. And Colombia is a lovely country. My Gatto Institute companion decided to go out and walk around town, and I remember saying to him, "Marshall, there has to be a reason why the guards in front of the hotel are carrying submachine guns." That's very impressive, I must tell you.
That must have been back during the Revolution days.
As I understand it, I would hardly represent myself as an expert on Colombia, but it's a kind of cash occupation to kidnap people. So
yeah, well, I know it used to be a lot worse back in the 80s and 90s, but I think it's pretty mellow and considered a
well, that would be good, because it's a country well worth going to. Anyway, my Gatto partner strayed a few blocks away from the hotel, and I went to find him. He said he was just going to look at the market down the street. So when I got there, he was clearly being surrounded. It wasn't right up against his body, but you could see that a cordon had been made around poor Marshall. And fortunately, somebody from the hotel, probably because this fellow was well known, came with a guard after us, and when they pulled us both away and got us back to the hotel, he said they were going to kidnap you. So I got a good laugh out of that, too, because I'm not worth a sou.
Yeah, Colombia today is actually a favorite tourist destination, but there was a while there that it was pretty bad down there.
Well, it deserves to be. The people are wonderful. The food is excellent, and the country itself is quite lovely.
Yeah, I've been down to South America. I haven't been into Peru or into Colombia specifically, but I've spent some time down there. Would you like to talk about the old schoolhouses?
Sure. What developed American power, inventiveness, and wealth was a kind of crazy quilt of schooling offerings, but I'll go to the more formal ones in 1- and 2-room schoolhouses, which would contain between 40 and 90 kids, since it was impossible, especially in the independent era of colonial America and early federal America, to actually teach 90 kids. They were broken up into groups, and those groups were half taught by accomplished students, not A students, but students accomplished in leadership and with a pretty good understanding of what the business to be learned was. Because of this heavy student participation, and I would say also the shortness of the term of confinement, it hardly ever went beyond 2.5 months, and the average amount of time per day was 2 hours. I mean, some places like Boston, it was longer than that, but not much longer. So as a consequence, what you were talking to me about Linux, a kind of open source learning where everyone was a potential teacher, and any area of interest potentially could connect you with a whole lot of the learnings that would help you navigate the society. Because of that, I believe that the curriculum, the formal curriculum written down in the book, was easily superseded by a kind of practical curriculum, and I'll be specific about this. Whatever seemed to be taught, here are some of the things that were at the center of the curriculum, and I'm even going to sidestep the trivium and quadrivium, which are excellent ways to organize. But I'm going to sidestep those and say that probably the single distinguishing characteristic of an excellent mind, a trained mind, is the ability to concentrate and shut out everything else. In fact, there probably are no theories of intelligence that don't move concentration to the number one position as the most reliable evidence that you're dealing with a strong mind. Well, think of the schooling that exists now. The bells ring, or the horns or the buzzers, every 42 minutes. But in the meantime, it takes 10 minutes for all the kids to string into class because there are no penalties, nor do they understand what they're costing themselves. There are infinite numbers of loudspeaker announcements, messengers pounding on the door. I mean, our schools are a chaos of broken time. Now I'll step back a little bit farther and say, if somebody wanted to be certain that concentration didn't develop across a wide front, in students, they would invent the kind of schooling that we have. Okay. The next thing I think that no one would disagree about is that the skills of associating with all kinds of people to move into a leadership association or a follower association or to an egalitarian association, those skills are priceless. Priceless. They don't tend to develop in an environment where you're not supposed to talk, and you're not supposed to talk to anyone except the authority in front of the class. I could really beat this to death, but if you just wanted to create a skillful association and someone skilled at concentration, you would not go about it the way we're doing it. Now let me move into a third area, which most people would put first, probably, I would guess. The ability to express yourself verbally and behaviorally in all kinds of situations is just a sine qua non of opportunity. There's so many ways you can step on someone's toes or make yourself seem unacceptable to a group that if we only taught expression and left everything else up to the kids, we would be doing them a grand favor. So now we have concentration, association, expression, none of which are priorities, even in the gifted and talented programs. Then let me add what the early Americans may well have put at the top, and that was raw experience. You only need to read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography to see that by the age of 11, he probably had, certainly by the age of 13, he had more experience than the average person who grows up and drops dead in New York City. And he was hungry, and so were all of the people he associated with. He was hungry to get raw experience. Even though he came from a family, they weren't poor, but they had no money. There were 17 kids. He crossed the Atlantic twice all by himself. I mean, we're talking about the 18th century, where it was, as they say, a trip. He put himself through a curriculum, and so did his friends. After working 60 hours a week, that Yale or Harvard would not dream of asking their undergraduates to match. So we have been stupendously dumbed down. Now I've touched four bases: concentration, association, expression, experience. We could go a little bit farther, but I think that's enough for a first chapter of reforming, when I say your own practice, I mean anyone listening who has kids, whether they're in school or whether they're being homeschooled.
What is the purpose of modern education?
Aha! Well, if you put yourself through a short course in the great philosophers of Western history, it's probably true the great philosophers of Eastern history too, but I'm much more knowledgeable about our part of the world, you would find that from Plato onwards, without exception, nobody believed that what you and I call education could possibly be true for most of the population, because they were hopelessly trapped in however they were born. You could condition habits and you could condition attitudes, so you might get the simulation of a learned person, but It's well, we're all familiar. Plato divides people into gold, silver, bronze, and lead, I believe. Well, it's about 40 years since I've read it. You don't transmute those metals. You're stuck with them, and the base metals are a threat to the precious metals. Now move up quite a way through history to the so-called move up to John Calvin, who was a magnificently learned attorney before he became the king Protestant theologian. And read Institutes of the Christian Religion, which will certainly give anyone who reads it a headache, but not because Calvin wastes words. He has a trained lawyer's mind. He says that salvation is already decided before you're born. About 1 person out of every 20 has been selected for salvation. The people so selected cannot commit an act so heinous, mass murder, forget it. They were called justified sinners. They were going to heaven regardless of what they did. But everybody else, let's say 95% of the population, was doomed whatever they did. So forget the old Catholic idea of good works and you earn your way to heaven. There was no way to get there. Now, what Calvin proposed, since 19-to-1 odds are pretty heavy odds to deal with if you happen to be saved, he constructs brilliantly a system of mass forced education. Forced is the important word, in which the denizens of the schools are so confused by half-truths and mal-teaching that they're never going to be a serious problem to the saved again. Let's jump a few hundred years forward in history to the so-called liberal philosopher Spinoza in Holland, taught everywhere as this grand liberal and champion of freedom. There's a truth there, but it's only true for 1 person out of 20. What Spinoza wrote, and I'll give you the actual reference because I have a feeling you'll have some scholarly listeners, readers. What Spinoza said was that the vast majority of the human race is murderously irrational. There's no cure for us, just as there's no cure for being born made of lead, or no cure being born already doomed. And Calvin said there's no cure for this irrationality. And so to protect the good stuff, what has to be done is a system of universal forced schooling set up, which deliberately pumps the mind full of half-truths and outright errors, deprives the people of skill by teaching subjects rather than skills. I mean, concentration, association, expression are skills, but now we could turn that into English. What does that mean? Language arts. What does it mean? What does social studies mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything. It means whatever the particular instructor wants it to mean. So anyway, the big-time philosopher, though, who's after Spinoza, is the guy who inherits Immanuel Kant's chair at the University of Berlin. It's a fellow named Johann Fichte, spelled Fichte. And after Napoleon, with his amateur army, wipes out the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena in 1806, which takes place right under Immanuel Kant's window, right around the precincts of the University of Berlin. Fichte makes public demands on the King of Prussia. He says, we got wiped out this way, and after all, our economy's based on warfare, so it's not a good advertising. He said, we lost because sergeants thought for themselves and lieutenants thought for themselves. He demanded that the King of Prussia institute a system of forced schooling which would begin in early childhood and last until any scrap of independent critical thinking is wiped out. And according to Fichte, and of course Spinoza said exactly the same thing, the imagination is the great enemy of the best people, because if this mass that's hopeless has an imagination left alive, it can surprise their betters. So he said, you got to wipe out the imagination. Well, now that sounds like a pretty big bill of goods, but it's not a big bill of goods if you put somebody in a rigorous, time-constrained environment, you deprive them of any other source of wisdom except the official state teaching. You can do quite a number on the imagination. And furthermore, if you tell them what they're supposed to imagine. So the popular expression is, if you don't teach them to connect the dots for themselves, but simply to memorize what they're told to memorize, and if they're going to have chains of analyses, those are to be memorized too. It doesn't really take very long before the mind can't do this for itself. In the current issue of the Atlantic, it used to be called the Atlantic Monthly, there's an article about what the effect of prolonged joblessness is going to be on this country, and the Atlantic writer predicts joblessness will last as far into the future as we can see, that there'll be temporary recoveries, but there'll be illusions. In the course of doing that, and this is the current issue of Atlantic, March 10th, I believe is cover date, the fellow says that the highly structured school childhoods that the young adults have come out of right now have temperamentally unprepared them for the circumstances of the moment, that the graduates dislike the idea of work, and about 1/3 of them don't even try to engage the jobs market. And these are qualities directly quoted from that article. When he's profiling what these new young men and women are like, he says they blame others for their own difficulties. They expect someone else to fix any problems they encounter. They lack independence, entrepreneurialism, leadership skills, problem-solving ability, and they need almost constant direction. We're not talking about the dunces. We're talking about the best who come out of these programs. They flounder without precise guidelines. That's what forced schooling teaches. You wait for someone else to tell you what to do. And yet in the world you and I have been plunged in, what it demands is adaptability, perseverance, enterprise, and humility, not self-esteem. Our recent graduates expect rewards without exchanging successful performance for them. What we desperately need is children willing to give value back to the community, young people rooted in the work that a coherent society needs them to do. And if you say, well, what work is that? I urge your listeners to pick up the 100-page long autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and prepare, if you haven't read it before, to have your hair stand up straight on your head. We've created a mass of parasitic young people who essentially can't do anything. And more than that, they don't want to do anything. They want to be cared for. We have a leadership that collapses the economy and pays themselves $100 million bonuses a year. I mean, we're in a much deeper mess, I think, than even the newspapers acknowledge. It's not temporary at all.
I think the newspapers are actually behind in helping to promote this whole system. You know, they certainly aren't doing investigative quality journalism anymore. You have to go to the internet and places like that to get good independent journalism these days.
Yes, I would agree with you. Of course, the newspapers and the magazines are owned by the people who own the economy, but I'll pass that by.
All right. Do genetics and eugenics play into the organizational structure of the modern school system?
Hugely. The biggest culprit, I named Spinoza and Calvin and Fichte and Plato. By far, the biggest culprit is Charles Darwin. By far, the innocent man of wealth who travels on the Beagle and publishes a book in 1859 called Origin of Species. And I want your listeners to listen hard enough to hear, I'm not talking about the theory of evolution. I'm talking about Darwin's conclusion 12 years after he wrote Origin of Species. The book is The Descent of Man. It will be in every library in the United States. That's how carefully it's put out there, so that the inner circle club can renew their faith in what they're doing. What he says in Descent of Man is that the overwhelming mass of the human race, including all the Irish, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit Irish, but the audiences who want to be skeptical, I urge them to go to Descent of Man and read what Darwin says about the Irish. If these lower forms of life, which are about 95% of the people on Earth, including, as I said, all the Irish, if they crossbreed with the good stuff, Darwin said evolution would march backwards into the swirling mists of the dawnless past. In other words, if you're a responsible person of means, then what you have to do is join in a kind of gentleman's agreement to separate the good breeding stock from the bad breeding stock, which is, after all, 95% of the population, and then turn that 95% against one another. Because just as Calvin discovered, 19 to 1 odds are bad odds. There aren't enough of the good people to keep the bad people down. They have to be trained to keep themselves down. And far and away the best way to do that is what Julius Caesar discovered when he was conquering Gaul. You set your enemies against themselves in large ways and small ways. You underwrite and maintain infinite numbers of competitions so they come to see one another as their enemies and someone blocking their path to opportunity. I mean, we start this in first grade, so that if some of your listeners say, "Is he going to attack competition?" No. In a moment, I'm going to argue that one form of competition is utterly essential to a good life. But first, let me take the pop quizzes and prelims and standardized tests and final exams, midterm exams. What we're dealing with here is a way to keep the ordinary population from bonding together in common interest. You'll recall that in the standard biography of Horace Mann by Messerly is the writer's name. Messerly notes that there's a curious entry in Horace Mann's diary that he made while he was watching a parade of working men in Boston in 1843. Mann jots down this thought: we must find a way to break the bond of association among working men. What could that possibly mean? Why must we find a way to do that? Well, I won't pursue that any further because I get back to the main theme here. Whenever the society, and I mean its managers, need people to learn something, they remove the competitive part entirely, and now I will set out to prove that to you. Our kind of commercial society, spread out over, millions of square miles, cannot exist unless virtually everybody can drive. Obviously, buying cars and maintaining them is also a big chunk of the whole economy. But you've got to have everybody drive, 10 miles to get a pack of cigarettes, whatever. As a consequence, nobody fails the driving test. Yes, people who failed it twice. Everybody always gets their driver's license. And let me prove this a little bit further. We're not talking about hiring an A student over a B student to be a clerk in an office. We're talking about life and death. If anybody actually thought that measuring the degrees of distinction in driving, which is, I said, life and death, mattered, then every automobile would have to have an electronic display saying this driver is C+. Why shouldn't you have a right to know that information? Well, once again, I'm not going to beat that to death. The same thing's true about frontline soldiers. When I was in basic training in San Antonio, Texas, you couldn't get through basic training unless blindfolded. You could take a rifle apart and put it back together again. Well, it had 57 little parts, some of them really little. Blindfolded, you dropped one. But I don't know anybody who was recycled through basic training. I imagine a tiny handful must have been, but I'm sure they passed it the second time through, because everyone on a rifle line has to be able to keep their rifle functioning. And at night, too, when you can't see, and everyone does, why don't they say, this is an A+ assembly. He did that in 90 seconds. And here's a failure. He did it in 3.5 minutes. Well, once again, my original premise is if the society or the leadership of the society requires that everybody knows something, even something difficult and dangerous like highway driving or assembling a rifle in combat situation, they do learn it. somebody younger than me may have that idea and write a book about it. I mean, it's a rich field of exploration.
You mentioned the Prussian education system earlier. Would you care to provide more detail about that?
The idea was to break the imagination, break association with other people so they couldn't band together and mutiny in the battlefield. Excuse me. All of this was drawn, by the way, from observations on the battlefield at Jena, where this highly trained military force of Prussia was just wiped out by these amateurs of Napoleon. Remember, Napoleon said that the lowest common soldier should have a field marshal's baton in his pack and be able to think like the field marshal. That wasn't the Prussian idea at all. They divided their schooling into three parts. There was the people's school called the Volksschule, or Volksschulen, which wiped out your imagination and filled your mind with nonsense so that you were like a child and very obedient. Then there was the Realschulen, the real schools. Those were to train the assistants of the leaders. Those were to train the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the people who served the managerial classes. And they were to learn how to specialize. They could learn the people's schools, you never did anything except memorizing facts and obeying orders. But the real schools, you got a chance to think in context. But only in a specialty, so that created the specialists, and the idea spread all around the world from Prussia. But finally, there were the academy schools. And the funny thing is, if you read about how those were organized internally, and what I'd recommend for someone starting out is to read von Humboldt's I forget the title, but it deals with how you fashion a school that creates leadership, independent thought, all those good things. And it's just a marvelous formulation, and it's a couple of 100 years old. Von Humboldt's the guy they named the current in the ocean after, and he was widely considered to be the smartest, most accomplished man in the world. So the academy schools taught, for example, that war was play and that you could get prodigies of value out of your soldiers as long as the officers didn't take the rules seriously. So the American Army in World War II had 60,000 pages of rules, but the Prussian Army the German Army encouraged its unit commanders to adapt to the circumstances in front of them on the spot, to think for themselves. As a consequence, and I'm quoting the famous Israeli military historian, oh, come on, John, don't let your memory fail you now. Anyway, I'm quoting an Israeli military historian who said that even in the last days of the war, when the Germans were outnumbered everywhere and had no equipment to speak of or ammunition, that they inflicted 4 times more casualties on the forces that they encountered, even when outnumbered 4-1, than they took themselves. And it's because everyone was trained to adapt to circumstances. Whereas in the American Army, the British Army, if you screwed up and there was a rule showing that you disobeyed it, I mean, you were court-martial meat. I mean, all these fascinating clues are everywhere once you free your mind from from the rules and allow yourself some latitude to interpret the rules for yourself or to amend them for yourself. These are the people who go furthest. I guess most people listening would think it would be horrible if I said, which I'm going to say, that one of the worst punishments ever delivered to young people were the child labor laws. One of the worst punishments. Most people never recover from not encountering the world of work seriously.
And that's the exact opposite of what everybody actually thinks. When you hear of kids working, everybody says, "Oh, well, that's just horrible," and those slave drivers. But what you're saying is that giving children work actually builds smarter, better, stronger society.
Just what we knew for almost all our history. You pick up Warren Buffett's autobiography, and you'll discover that Warren Buffett had a profitable business for himself at the age of 6. And by the age of 13, he didn't come from a wealthy family. He had 5 profitable businesses for himself, in none of which did he do the work. He started the business, saw how it worked best, then he hired other kids to do it for him. When he applied to the Wharton School of Business at the age of 18, that was back, I think, in 1939, but don't hold me to the date, he had the modern equivalent of $100,000 in the bank. Not bad for an 18-year-old who didn't inherit anything. And what he did, everything he did, added value to the community around him. And furthermore, as you read the autobiography, you say, why someone could do all those things today because he did not preempt the entire market, but the tiniest fraction of the market there. And as soon as he had one going, he hired somebody to run it, and he started another one. Look at, who's the guy just built a rocket ship and sold all the seats for $250,000? Branson. If you read Branson's autobiography, I think Branson's the 24th wealthiest man in the world, but he grew up, his mother was an airline stewardess back in the days when that was dicey work. When he was 4 years old, create an image in your mind now of a 4-year-old. His mother drove him miles from their London home, not the easiest city to get around in, and said, Richard, do you think you could find your way home alone from here? And he said he thought he could. She pulled the car over and said, well, get out then and do so. And she went home. In his autobiography, he says this was far and away the educational experience of his life. He dropped out of high school, never went to college, and by 19, he was a millionaire, and not with the businesses he's now known for. Those came in, he's got about a dozen businesses operating. The inventor, or not the inventor, the creator of the Human Genome Project, the most prestigious scientific project in the world today. There are 2 of them. Francis Collins was homeschooled in a single-parent family on a remote sheep ranch in western Virginia. He had 3 brothers, and the only rule his mother applied was the 4 brothers had to agree what to study. There was no balanced diet, no nothing, except the 4 of them agreed, and they studied it as long as they felt like it, but nobody could leave until all 4 agreed they had worn that to death. That's one of the 2 creators of the Human Genome Project. The other one just published his autobiography. His name's Venter, Craig Venter. He was a C-, D+ student who only graduated from junior high school because the teachers changed his marks. He was such a reprehensible human being. They didn't want him back for a double dip. They passed him along. And did he start at Harvard, Yale, or Princeton? No. He started at age 18 as a medical corpsman in Vietnam. How about that? So those two guys created the Genome Project, which every business in the world's lined up to get rich off of now. Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, was declared, I think he was 9 years old, but he might have been 10, hopelessly dyslexic. In other words, it was just impossible for him to learn. So he dropped out of, I guess, junior high school, and he became a bicycle peddler of fish. If you would just create a picture in your mind, I can't think of a job more unrewarding
right.
if you want to buy a fish. But he mastered it, and he added wooden matches and Christmas tree ornaments. And, of course, 15 years later, there were these IKEAs all over the world. We go on and on and on and on. The number one patent holder in U.S. history with patent for the telephone and the phonograph, Thomas Edison, was working as a gopher on a long-distance train in Michigan, 1,000 miles from his home in Edison, somewhere in New Jersey, when he was like 9 years old. And by the time he was 12, he set up a printing press. He found a broken printing press, repaired it in a boxcar on the train, and he was getting Civil War news off the train's telegraph before the newspapers had it. So at whistle stops, he was selling a broadsheet called the Grand Trunk Herald for like $0.10 or $0.25 a copy when that was real money. And by the time he was 18, he had a nice fat stake and could set himself up in business. We have artificially extended childhood to such a gross extent now that an awful lot of our young people never recover from it. And the ones that do are always bringing up the rear. And yet we could cure this virtually overnight without spending a nickel. The kids need heavy experience in concentrating, and usually that's best on something of your own selection. If you've ever tried to pry a kid away from like a video game, or in my day, from a chess set, you know that they're perfectly capable of concentrating for long stretches of time until the habit of schools almost destroys that in most of us. Then we become antsy, with a 1 minute ad. We want quarter minute ads or 5 second ads.
Sally, Dick, and Jane. John, do you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sally, Dick, and Jane.
Well, the Sally part came later. Dick and Jane, the textbook publishing industry is 55% of all the profit in publishing, and it's been that way since World War I. The textbooks are the creation of committees. Every member of the committee who counts, at least the voting majority of these committees, represents stakeholders in the community, in real estate, in merchandising, in whatever. The Prussian the Prussian program, let me call it that, is intended to make people manageable so that you can efficiently manage, because you can predict what the people are thinking and what they'll do with their time. It wasn't very long before, from Darwin's first cousin, Francis Galton, mathematical formulae were available to predict, and it was part of the whole statistical package that emerged in the 19th century, to predict what people were going to buy. Market research, we call it now. Well, it was early on discovered that market research, which asks you to invest, millions of dollars in something, was highly unreliable. I know that will come as a surprise to some of your prosperous readers who buy it. I said. And there was a kind of a panic because the utopian future was going to be constructed out of market research. Then, if I say someone, I'm speaking metaphorically now, it was a lot of someones, came to the conclusion that you could rig the game if you made the people predictable, if you standardized them, yes, just like the standardized test do, then these mathematical formula were very, very reliable. They didn't work all the time, but they came pretty darn close to working if you ask enough people. And so, probably in the decade before and the decade after World War I, the population was standardized, and we shot to the top of the world's economies in merchandising. You could predict in advance that people would mortgage their future, their children's future, to buy whatever you promoted often enough or correctly. And that kind of logic is unstoppable until ultimate efficiency is reached, until whatever you offer for sale, and this, of course, was the great, great breakthrough that took place right around the turn of the 20th century. Instead of being crippled by the old-fashioned law of supply and demand, it became known to the managerial classes that demand was quite easy to create. And there were a whole lot of specific tools you could create it with. You could stick your product next to a pretty girl. You could have the King of England put a seal on it. Lots of ways to do it. And the more you spend on these promotions, almost invariably, the more you could sell. People didn't know whether they needed it or not. They knew just what teachers had taught them. Do what you're told. So we eroded away the critically analytical part of the ordinary mind. By ordinary, I don't mean it's not bright, but it's habit trained to defer to experts.
How do those books work specifically to?
Oh well, this is just brilliant. It's not my brilliance; it's the brilliance of the design. There's a wild card loose in all the libraries of the planet and all the used bookstores and stuff, that the wisest, brightest people in the history of the world have left behind a printed legacy, so that no matter how you dumb down your population, if they could read well enough, they would eventually maybe find their way to find their way to Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, where he says that nothing you can buy is worth having, and nobody you can boss around with your power is worth associating with. Now, there's a dangerous idea, right? How are you going to prevent people from reading Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, since the best people want to have access to those books too? Well, one way to do it is to discourage people by training them in such a simplistic manner in reading. I'll give you a very specific here, that they cannot read Latinate sentences. Latinate sentences put their meaning at the end of the sentence. Loose English sentences, common sentences, put their meaning at the beginning of the sentence. It's only to watch bright 13-year-olds, as I did for many years, say, I can't read this, to realize how diabolical the conditioning is that habituates you to childish stuff, so that when you get stuff that really is vitamins and minerals, and furthermore is inherently very, very interesting, you say, that's not for me, I can't read that. There. It doesn't take very long to pat children on the head. Look at what we do in kindergarten. An Australian kindergarten teacher came to me, so I don't want to claim the originality of this idea. And she said, we spend the first week in kindergarten here teaching the kids the colors. She said, I have never in 8 years teaching known a single kid who arrived at kindergarten who didn't already know the colors. So she said by week 5 or 6, when we teach the kids what they already know, they've already shut off to the value of, the intellectual diet we're offering. I thought it was a brilliant insight. And of course, I saw it on in an older cohort than that. It's what the real difference between the best private universities and the best public universities is. The public universities condition their students to think in terms of, quote, getting a good job, close quote. The private universities teach getting an independent livelihood, a world of difference, right? In 1859, when Abraham Lincoln spoke to the Wisconsin Agricultural Association, he said that we would never end up in the mess that Britain and Germany are in, where the ordinary population is a proletariat. They're like slaves, working for somebody else. He said in this country, mind you, it's 1859, 75% of the population has an independent livelihood, and the other 25%, except for a few ne'er-do-wells and deadbeats, are putting together a capital stake in order to have an independent livelihood. Well, Abe, you're rolling over your grave now, because independent livelihoods were put to death by institutional schooling that starts in kindergarten and tells you the point is, it's not even intellectual development. It's getting a good job. It seems to me, and of course I'm 75, that whether you're a well-paid slave or a poorly paid slave, you're a slave. Look at the slaves now being thrown out of work by the tens of thousands they will never find that work again. They will not find it. The economy may recover, but there's no room for them.
And what I find interesting, and down in South America, so many families and people have these small little businesses in their house or things that they do, but it seems to me that when the economy gets bad, it almost has a reverse effect that people have more business-like intuition or more creativity, and that they actually start creating these small types of self-sustaining businesses. Have you seen that or considered that?
Oh, yeah. An awful lot of, well, I don't know, it's probably not a majority, but there's a substantial fraction of the executive class who is quite aware when they lose their position that nobody is going to want them again. I mean, almost independent of their track record, because you can always hire somebody almost as good for a third of the wages. This happens, by the way, to engineers regularly, that when you become a senior engineer, and including in the computer world, when you're over 40 and you have some really good track record behind you, who the hell wants you? I mean, you're being paid 6-7 times what a trainee is. You have an uppity attitude as if you're owed decent treatment. I've not only spoken to dozens of engineers who lose their work in their 40s and never find work again. Bill Gates, at the very same time, he calls on the governors of America to send everybody in school to college. I mean, it's quite a good market for, hardware and software. Has quietly started in India and China training colleges, and he lobbies behind the scenes for the U.S. government to waive its rules, its limitation on importing these people to take American jobs. I mean, he's quite the quisling.
Let's talk about Dr. Seuss and the Cat in the Hat.
Well, you're going to have to prompt me a little farther, because it's 75. My brain is partly ossified.
Well, in your book, you mentioned that the origins of the Dr. Seuss story were they had basically come to him and said that they wanted.
Oh yeah, okay. You primed the pump enough. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, textbook publishing in reading became an extremely attractive way to become filthy rich, because states like Texas or California or a few others would bulk buy, if you could politically get your reading text past the committee. I mean, these states would buy, 500,000 copies of your book, and then next year you'd buy 500,000, and the year afterward you'd put a different cover on it. Then buy another. I mean, it'd go on forever. It was a money machine. However, what was at work at that time? Because obviously this could have gone in the direction of increasingly intellectual textbooks, but it went in just the opposite direction. Following the German model, the dumbing down isn't done all at once. It's an incremental procedure to where you reach, as Dr. Seuss came on the scene as a young man, and certainly not as a man intending to harm anybody, but he came across the scientifically controlled word list, where instead of drawing on the 1.5 million or 2 million words in the rich English language. I mean, you cut down the possible word use, I don't know, 1,500 or 2,000, probably in special situations a good deal less than that. So Seuss felt trapped, sort of, and he invented his really droll and delightful little rhyming presentations out of these controlled word lists. And almost certainly there's, if you get Seuss the controlled word list, you're actually getting some benefit that has little to do with building your lexicon, but certainly rhythmically and emphases in other ways. But what the public needs to know is this was done under the camouflage, under the guise of the world wars, when the public's attention was concentrating on, slap the Jap and all the rest of the stuff, and humble the Hun, because it'd be the First World War. These could be rushed through state legislatures, and naturally you'd cut key people in on it. And not cynically. Remember, they're drawing on the wisdom of Charles Darwin and a number of other big names, saying that you may as well not waste any effort on these people because they're, in Darwin's case, they're biologically permanently inferior, or in Calvin's they're spiritually inferior, or in Spinoza's they're psychologically inferior, or in Fichte's they're politically inferior, and the system can't work without political inferiority. So there are solid rationales that you can use to salve your conscience when you're doing this. Look, you could stop 500 people at random on the streets of your town, and I'd drop dead if more than one or two had any idea what the term overproduction means. And yet, without knowing what overproduction means, you're missing one of the great justifications for dumbing down young America. Go back to colonial days. The ideal, and a lot of people approached the ideal. I guess not many ever got there, but the ideal was you produced your own shelter, your own clothing, your own food, your own entertainment, your own education, your own medical care. So to be a perfect producer was the ideal. Well, how on earth could a corporation survive if that attitude survived? The whole idea of a corporation, and I want to extend it beyond commerce into government. The whole idea of a corporation is the corporation will do for you. You just sit back and buy it or accept it.
Well,
pardon me?
Let me, if I may, read the Dr. Seuss quote from your book, Underground History of American Education. This is quoting Dr. Seuss. I did it for a textbook house, and they sent me a word list. That was due to the Dewey Revolt in the 1920s, in which they threw out phonics reading and went to word recognition, as if you're reading a Chinese pictograph instead of blending sounds or different letters. I think killing phonics was one of the greatest causes of illiteracy in the country. Anyway.
It was the greatest cause, and the Prussians worked it out. The Prussians, being a little more rigorous than us, didn't have a whole word system. They started out with a whole paragraph system. So you memorized a paragraph, but that didn't work. So they went to a whole sentence system. Our whole word system is a pale competitor. It was meant deliberately to prevent people from being able to get into those forbidden books and maybe develop their intellect. Australia uses it today. Even the schools today that say they use phonics use some bastardized half measure. Let me tell you, when I went to school at age 5 years old, and my mother didn't have a high school diploma, and my father didn't have a college diploma, I could read fluently. Dick and Jane, hardly. I was reading, the last thing I read before I went to first grade with my mother was Matthew Arnold's epic of ancient Persia called Sohrab and Rustum. You'd have a hard time finding that today. So I got to first grade, and what I expected were the glories of intellect. Instead, I got talking choo-choos. You know, there are so many ways this thing is accomplished. I mean, it's a net that's hard to escape.
Here's the rest of Dr. Seuss's quotes in your book, and he says, anyway, they had it all worked out that a healthy child at the age of 4 can only learn so many words in a week. So there were 223 words to use in this book. I read the list 3 times, and I almost went out of my head. I said, I'll read it once more, and if I can find 2 words that rhyme, that'll be the title of my book. I found cat and hat and said, the title of my book will be The Cat in the Hat.
Yes, yes, yes. So you're embedded, we're embedded, the parents of children who are listening to you, you're embedded in a house of mirrors. You know, nothing is what it seems to be. If our productive population couldn't be reduced to a consuming population, the rise of the corporations could not have taken place. And if we return to being a productive population, now it wouldn't be a decade before you would see the economy radically transformed. The corporation, and I'm not speaking from a political perspective, of left or right, the corporation must, for its health, have a clientele who are incomplete, radically incomplete, as a matter of fact. There's almost no degree of incompletion that's not tried to reach. Even the diet of people who eat ground up cows' noses and ears and hooves, cows slaughtered in South America because you don't have to follow the humane rules that are built up here, hamburgers that kill enormous numbers of people. I'm not making that up. The #1 bestseller in the country for 2 years was Fast Food Nation.
Right.
And it stated categorically how many 13 people per day die horribly. Their insides liquefied from, I'll indict Big Macs, but it's the whole mess of them. And 250 people a day are hospitalized. Well, how could the government allow that to happen? Because these businesses are the foundation of factory agriculture. They're the far and away the biggest clients for tomatoes, onions, lettuce, wheat, mustard, ketchup, mayonnaise, on and on. And the Big Gulp, I don't know if they're out in California, the Big Gulp, which I think is 64 ounces of pop, and it has 48 teaspoons of sugar in it, is a guarantee that the medical profession will have unlimited diabetes amputations to perform.
Oh, for sure. And not only that, but they're using corn syrup, which is far worse than sugar. And there's there's
I'll take your word. In fact, I know that to be true.
right,
But
and
the sugar's bad enough.
it is,
Yeah.
but there's a couple of great documentaries out there on this. One is called King Corn, and another one, Food Inc., that also covers the whole meat industry and how awful it is in this country. But having been down to South America 6 months ago, I've got to say that the meat quality standards down there are far higher than in the United States.
Here's the problem. The meat standards down there are not the meat standards for the slaughterhouses that are exclusively contracted to serve Burger King and McDonald's, etc.
Oh, I see, right. Yeah,
the
they're not.
description in Fast Food Nation is essentially the Harvard, and I'm indicting Harvard the same way I'm indicting McDonald's. It's the whole pack of them. The business school figured out that humane slaughter was very expensive. That what you could do is simply put 100 animals in a room and club them to death with mallets. And of course what that does is it drives fecal matter through the meat. However, what they figured out was if you heat the meat to a certain temperature and hold it at that temperature for the right number of seconds, all the little poop bacilli will be killed, and no one has to be the wiser that they're eating poop burgers. Well, that probably would work to save billions of dollars. There's one flaw in the ointment. When you hire kids at minimum wage to perform these crucial operations, they're not always the most scrupulous about reaching that temperature and holding it long enough. As a consequence, we have 13 people a day dead and 250 people a day hospitalized. Why don't you hear about that? Well, the people who do that are intermarried with the people who own the newspapers, the TV stations. The government certainly doesn't want the key to the treasury and factory agriculture thrown away. That's why I say you're living in a hall of mirrors where nothing's what it seems to be. So the way out will not come through the ballot box because nobody gets on the ballot for all practical purposes. The people who get on the ballot are the same people. Look at their campaign contributors. Look at their family associations. If I hear the term right or left one more time, I think I'll shoot somebody dead. There is no left in this country, and there's no right in the country. There may be on the lunatic fringe. I don't know, but they're all the same. They're homogenous.
Exactly.
They are textbook 19th century liberals, and the word has migrated in its meaning. What the word liberal meant was you're liberated from any of the restrictions on your behavior that are put on by religion or by tradition or by family ties or by decency. You're liberated from that. You're liberated from owing anything to your nation. The two Bush presidencies were textbook liberal. You know, as I say, when I heard the word conservative views, I said, Orwell is smiling in his grave. Newspeak is alive and well.
Oh, for sure.
Us.
Well, you know, John, that's interesting that you bring this up because I've actually written two articles, one on the definition of liberal and the other on the definition of conservative. And I published...
Do mail me tear sheets. I'll read them with great interest.
I'll do that. I will. All right. Let's go into some of the bad guys. Let's talk about J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, those kind of fellas.
Okay. Well, let us start with Horace Mann, because he's the patsy and the fall guy. Mann he grew up on a farm, and the father had died, and so Mann made straw hats, and he never wanted to see a straw hat again to keep him and his mom alive. But he married well. He married I think the president of Brown University's daughter. And although he had no interest whatsoever in schools, this is rich, he was approached by wealthy families, railroading families, which was the big corporation of the day, and told that if he could succeed in getting compulsory school laws passed, that he would be given Daniel Webster's seat in Congress. So he was a good speaker, and he was in the state legislature. He set out on a 10-year quest to bring compulsion schooling out of Prussia into the United States. And he succeeded. I believe the year was 1852. But I'm telling you, he had no interest in schools at all, but he was a practical politician and an ambitious straw hat maker. So Mann immediately caught on that what he said, or what mothers and fathers said, really didn't amount to a hill of beans. It was the great industrialists who were shaping the United States. And if you didn't have an alliance with those people, your personal ambition wasn't going to go very far. So Mann did what he was ordered to do, and then they screwed him. You and I might not think he'd been screwed, but he was exiled out of the civilized world to Western Ohio, or central Western Ohio, where a utopian colony was being converted into a college called Antioch. Now, it's got a pretty good rep, at least it did when I was in college, and yet, in those days, it was just so far off the beaten track that it was like a pension. So Mann died a very bitter man, because when they had used him, they had no more use for him. Now what we were left with was the American tradition of tremendous independence and self-reliance, which was not so easy to deal with. In Massachusetts it was, in New York it was, in the Tidewater. But as soon as you went inland, here were people used to producing everything for themselves or exchanging with their neighbors. Here was this tight, flinty-eyed community of competent people. So you had to begin cutting into that. And that was done by a combination of bribes from the federal government, legislation that threw advantages to people who played ball, and so on. And what was the point of this great transformation? It was that Carnegie, Rockefeller, Astor, Vanderbilt, and maybe a dozen or 24 other major names,
like J.P. Morgan, etc.
Morgan was he was the banker. Morgan was the leading Episcopalian layman on planet Earth. And why that's important is the State Church of England says in its homily of obedience that God has put us all in our place. It's sort of like Plato, and if you try to get out of your place, you're insulting God. Remember, you have to have a justification to explain to your children so you can live with yourself while you're screwing your neighbors. So Morgan was the only one of those people, by the way, who had the benefit of at least a partial Prussian education. He had a year over there, so people came back from Prussia imbued with this idea that people were only machinery, and that if you found the right algorithms, you could make the machinery work efficiently. So Morgan, who had eyes like an approaching express train, I think that were described once. Yes, he was part of the inner circle. And each one of these inner circle people, Morgan included, founded a private boarding school to protect the good breeding stock. Morgan's was Kent, which I think is up in Connecticut. Hotchkiss, who invented the machine gun, was Hotchkiss. And each one of these guys had their own boarding school. The Peabody family, I think, did Groton, which gave us Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Meanwhile, what they wanted was the American population converted from people who wanted an independent livelihood into people who wanted a good job. That was a hard sell, but not if you took their children, 5 years old, and you kept them for 10 or 12 years. Then you created a breach between the parents who remembered what an independent livelihood really meant, and the children who had these little prizes dangled in front of them. Good job prizes, a raise, a corner office, all the rest of that crap. And inside of, I would say, 3 generations, they broke the entrepreneurial spirit of the country and replaced it with a corporate spirit, a corporate government. I mean, one of their great creations was to fool people into thinking that the government represents one interest and the capitalists represent another interest. That is quite untrue. Capitalism could not survive without a gigantic government. The government is the buffer, the flywheel. It represents the people, right? Well, you notice that the current representative of the people quickly passed, I don't know, what was it, $1 trillion to the same bankers who had ruined the country.
Right.
I mean, we are so brainwashed and conditioned. I can't listen to the so-called right-wing talk shows anymore because they're so innocent. They're so stupid. They're so brainwashed. They do the work that otherwise
I couldn't agree more. And of course, somebody up on high is putting those guys in those positions, like Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and a number of others.
Oh, of course.
They're putting them in those positions because they beckon to the stupidity of the average American that's been brainwashed.
Well, they're riding aggressively on a foundation that's been carefully built for over 100 years now. That, well, we would be gratified if government got smaller, because they bulk our efficiency in business. Well, the first Bush presidency, that conservative, tripled the size of government. I mean, these are black and white figures, and the second guy, because he obviously was a stupid man, only doubled the size of government.
Right.
But even I was optimistic that someone who spoke so beautifully, who so obviously had been trained in rhetoric, which has been cut out of the public school diet. Expression is something forbidden to.
You talking about Clinton or Obama?
I'm talking about Obama. I said, there still is a glimmering of hope.
Right.
When his first act in office was to turn the Treasury over to the bankers who had ruined us.
Right.
If we make 10 million new jobs, we will only be back at 5% unemployment. When I was a boy during the Second World War, 5% unemployment was considered the revolutionary tipping point. Beyond that, so many people would be angry and disaffected that you'd start getting stamps stolen out of the office drawer and a million other acts of sabotage taking place. Now we say it's 10%. Read the Atlantic Monthly. It's 17.5%.
Right.
The Atlantic Monthly doesn't have a reputation. That's a radical journal. Oh, my. So the Hall of Mirrors again. Nothing is what it seems to be.
Yeah, I do, and I'm glad you mentioned so many of those points, because these are all things that we've been covering on my show in great depth lately.
They couldn't go down the Bush Avenue any longer and push this project forward, because the project is meant to end in a global government in the hands of the right people. But they couldn't do that any farther with Bush's brand of, quote, conservatism. So they had to get in a liberal, quote, professor, but the balls, the chutzpah of the bank bailout, Look, I used to be a pretty shrewd student of economics. I mean, I went to the inside books, and the key to capitalism was created by a Princeton economics professor, well known to the inside circle. His name was Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter created the expression creative destruction, and he said the lifeblood of capitalism is letting businesses that can't cut it go belly up and turning all their employees out on the cruel market where they act as a brake on the wages of other people, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when Lockheed came along, and that was 30 years ago, that was creative destruction applied. When Chrysler went belly up, they're still in business, aren't they? And, of course, Goldman Sachs, and, I mean, good God, too big to fail. Have you heard that expression?
Oh, of course, like with AIG and these.
That's a purely socialist statement as you can conceive of.
Sure, and they're using it.
Capitalism is letting them go belly up, absorbing the turmoil that follows, and then reconstructing the market stronger and more efficient. We can't do that. Bush wouldn't allow that done, and neither will Mr. Obama allow that done. They're puppets. They're figureheads. There is no power in the presidency, and there's no difference who you elect. They've all been vetted throughout their lives. None of them are unsafe. I was kind of praying, and it doesn't matter which side of this spectrum you're on, I was kind of praying that Obama would appoint to his cabinet Noam Chomsky from MIT, Ralph Nader, I could name a few others, but you see, change you can believe in. I mean, and once again, whether your readers agree or not, it's immaterial here. I'm not trying to be right or wrong. I'm trying to say that to be consistent with a change you can believe in candidacy, one that turned out the young in just unbelievable numbers. They won't be back, I can tell you that. The appointees were the same old tired turtles that had run the economy into the sewer. And we'll never get out. There is no way to build the economy in such a way that apart from the entitlements, you can actually pay back these loans. They can't be paid back. You can run a 20-30% inflation for a few years and repudiate the loans, which I certainly expect to happen. But otherwise, we're owned lock, stock, and barrel by China, by Malaysia, by Japan, by India.
I agree with you. All right, well, since we're on that subject, let's get into socialism, communism, and let's not forget Fabian socialism.
Wow, the Fabians were the big players in this. The Fabians were all dedicated Darwinists. So, as Katie Muggeridge writes in the biography of who was that Fabian lady who's buried in Westminster Abbey? Come on, I'm counting on you here now. My old.
You know, I'm not sure on that. I'm sorry.
Oh, she was the lady who wrote the labor legislation for Britain. She created the British welfare state.
Here, let me see here.
On his deathbed, the great classically conservative philosopher Herbert Spencer turned out to be the uncle of this lady, the head of the Fabian socialists. And they sat together as he was dying, and both of them agreed that they were working to the same Darwinian end. According to Spencer, the people should be killed by working them to death. And according to Beatrice...
Listening, and thank you for your support. We finished off with talking about the correlation between the male prison population and the male numbers in the military. And I wanted to follow up with that with asking you, what do you think about quote-unquote everybody?
Well, clarify.
Well, you've stated some things opposed to like some of the eugenics theories about what you think that everyone is capable of.
I see. My experience in 30 years in a classroom with about 3,500 assorted 13-year-olds mostly, 12 to 14, from all backgrounds and classified by the schools into a whole lot of different categories is very much like, I think, would have existed as my own point of view several hundred years ago. I think most of these distinctions are nonsense. I don't have much in common with Horace Mann, but his idea that we ought to have common schooling resonates very well with me. Many years I would have elite classes and classes straight out of the ghetto. And if you can overcome the superficial distinctions in idiom and background and experience, I didn't find much intellectual difference among those classes, and often I found that street kids who would never get an opportunity in their life, or very unlikely, were superior to the gifted and talented honors kids. Now that is said not cynically, but as an indication of immense problems that exist with institutional schooling, which I think are incurable. It's essentially a business and a jobs project. What nice people who are going about their own lives think romantically about schooling doesn't exist at all. It may exist in teacher A or teacher B, but the business is a business, and it is the largest business in the United States. It grants huge, lucrative contracts. It's the largest jobs project if you tie in all the collateral businesses that are necessary to sustain this. It's an immense waste of time and talent. I do think that we could get a lot more value out of everyone by, non-thread this thing is politically murder. Two things that could be done, however, is to remove the compulsion part, since for most of human history, whatever form of schooling existed was voluntary, and to remove the standardization, which is largely monitored by standardized tests. Those things don't correlate with anything you or I or anyone else would find a valuable part of our society, although managers find the obedience that it measures useful to them. But, it's a disgusting racket now.
Tell me about how insulting students is part of the breaking down of the student mentality.
Well, the principle we're tracking is Julius Caesar's wonderful discovery that if you can divide people against their own best interests so that they can't work cooperatively, that the role of management is a breeze, that if people are conquered just by being divided. Now, the very first commissioner of American schooling, National Commissioner of Schooling, a fellow named William Torrey Harris, wrote in 1906, and of course this is easily verifiable, that the point of institutional schooling was to turn people against themselves. So he was really quite advanced. The idea of dividing and conquer usually means several parties involved, but to be divided against yourself, self-alienation is the expression he used. That was the point of it, self-alienation. And he said in writing in The Philosophy of Education, published in 1906, he said, "This purpose is best achieved in dark, airless corridors," in other words, in dismal places. And anyone who's passed through the usual public schooling place knows what he's talking about. Now, he was very open about this whole enterprise being to the advantage of management. And as you and I talked about yesterday, the low opinion of ordinary people, the overwhelming mass of ordinary people, the low opinion assigned to them from Plato to Charles Darwin and beyond Darwin too, is what justifies this. If they can be converted into human resources, then you can get, according to this point of view, some value out of them. But if they retain independence, and what free will, then they're simply a huge annoyance. So that You know what interests me, and it really intrigues me, is a lot of perfectly respectable people read these things, and I don't know what they're thinking, that the person issuing such a statement as self-alienation being the purpose of schooling, and him being the top dog in the school institute, that what is he joking? What is the point of saying that? What is the point of Horace Mann saying we must find a way to break the bonds of association among working men? Do you actually think they didn't mean that? Then why say it? These clues to what the enterprise actually is are everywhere. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. For the most part, until very recently, the people doing this were fairly open about what they were up to. It's just, as I said a minute ago, perfectly intelligent people reading these things gloss over them. Oh, well, he didn't really mean that, I suppose, is the conclusion. Yes, they do mean that. And the institution has brought this nation to the edge of bankruptcy. Notice I don't use any romantic arguments at all or any moral arguments against this at all. This has destroyed us. Temporarily, when we got this up and running, it was a tremendous financial boost because we converted our population from an independent, self-reliant group into the most reliable domestic market the planet had ever seen. People willing to mortgage their future and their children's future to buy things and define themselves by what they own. That's corporate paradise, mass production paradise. But the trick was that slowly, incrementally, other nations on the planet, much more prepared to do this, slowly caught on to what we were doing. And they do it infinitely better than we ever are going to be able to do it. Let me just speak of China and India, although we could throw in Malaysia and Japan and probably other nations as well. China produces, through its training system, more engineers than all the rest of the nations of the world put together. According to the Financial Times of London, hardly your radical publication, China bids for construction projects, etc., on the world market at a rate 17% of what American firms bid at. Where exactly are improvements going to lead to a competitive position for us? Now the Financial Times also said that for ordinary single workers, China will deliver very well disciplined, very well trained, reliable workers, 30% less than the American training system does. And you and I spoke yesterday that very quietly, without their fellow citizens knowing it, people like Bill Gates lobby relentlessly to open the floodgates to foreign workers. Why not? They get them cheaper. They're more reliable than our workers. I mean, what's not to like from Gates' point of view? And Gates trains them himself on training campuses. And all this stuff is, again, I don't want to suggest a cabal, but this is quietly overlooked by the newspapers, the popular journals, television. This is something that gentlemen would rather not talk about. It lies at the heart of the capitalist logic, and I am not speaking from a politically adversarial point of view. You buy what you can buy at the very cheapest price, including labor, and you sell it at whatever the market will bear. I mean, this is Adam Smith. It's not, Joe Stalin or Karl Marx. We are so untrained to think. I'm talking about very intelligent people, that we simply swallow hook, line, and sinker, as the Rush Limbaughs and the Glenn Becks of the world do, whatever our betters tell us. You know, if I hear the term free market again, I don't think a free market has existed in the United States since I was born in 1935. The market's rigged by enormous subsidies that go to favored businesses. It's rigged in a half dozen other ways, but that way alone would tip the scales. You know, we have so many businesses that actually are bankrupt. They can't compete, but they seem to be able to compete because your tax money and mine gets poured into them in quiet, unnoticeable ways. And yet we bitch and scream, good God, you're going to give Medicare to somebody who can't get a job? I mean, this is outrageous. Well, it's outrageous that we have an auto industry at all. They have produced such junk for so many years. And it's sweetheart contracts. You know, the police department, the law says they have to buy, Fords. Why? They've been junk for 40 years. Why do they have to buy Ford? Because it's just part of this hall of illusion, hall of mirrors, I call it, that our society's become. It's truly disgusting, and it doesn't make the slightest difference whether Republicans have control of Congress or Democrats. They're the same people. Look at their campaign contributions. I mean, sometimes I'm in despair that otherwise intelligent people finally, when pushed to the wall, have to swallow the worm like a poor fish.
You know what? You had a section in your book, Underground History of American Education, on bell curves. Would you tell us about bell curves and what is the importance of that?
Sure. There's a number of 19th century mathematicians who explored the phenomenon of the bell curve. One is Darwin's first cousin, Francis Galton. Another one's a guy named Gauss, I think. And these are supposed to describe natural distributions of talent or productivity or achievement or whatever. And from the start, from the get-go in any exploration, they do that. What they do not do is uncover the fact that the lower segments of the bell curve are perfectly capable of upsetting the upper segments of the bell curve. We can't allow that to happen because what it would do is stand social class on its head. And social class is one of the reliable ways we organize our society. So the reason you're not allowed to measure the mayor's son or the doctor's son by performance, and instead they're measured by tests of memory like everybody else, these standardized measures, is because even from the get-go, these people often can't compete with ghetto residents. Let me be very specific. It's quite common for street kids at the age of 13, not all of them, of course, but it's quite common for a segment of them to have absolute mastery over public presentation. They're quick on their feet, they're very verbal, and they're not stupid. They have intelligence. Whereas the doctor's son, etc., the mayor's son, they're locked into formal presentation modes. They're not flexible. They're not adaptable. And so in half of my teaching career, I ran an intense speech program because I told the kids of the three literacies of speech, writing, and reading, far and away the most important is verbal facility. And no matter what field you're going into, including the sciences, the mute scientists always are exploited by the verbally facile scientists. They take credit for the discoveries of these troglodytes. So I said, we're going to spend a lot of time on your ability to do that, even in front of hostile audiences. What I quickly found was a tremendous discomfort among the kids used to getting A's in English because they could not compete with the ghetto kids, and so their mothers bitterly complained. I don't have the imagination to invent things like that. You've heard the expression, and everyone listening has, self-fulfilling prophecies. Well, the school is set up to certify the social class system and the economic class system that's in place now. That doesn't mean there isn't some variability and some room for upward and downward movement. It means there isn't much that reliably, from decade to decade, you can count pretty much on the same families and the same people being at the top. Now, at that point, they can claim we're biologically superior. Look at the evidence. But the game is rigged, structurally rigged. And the only teachers who can change that are the ones willing to sabotage the system from inside. And doing that is a very, very uncomfortable way to make a living. Although I guess it salves your conscience. I know I did it for many, many years. It takes every ounce of energy you can muster.
All right, what was the Gary plan?
Okay. When Rockefeller and Carnegie and a handful of others, but those are the two principal villains, when they wanted to import the Prussian system to the United States, well, Rockefeller bought a broken-down college in the Midwest called University of Chicago. It was really called the Chicago Institute, and he converted it into a Prussian university. What that means is that the undergraduates exist for one purpose only, and that's to be the low-paid slaves and serfs of the faculty, which engages in research. Now, a few of the undergraduates earn then their bones that way, and they are put on the fast track. And Rockefeller also bought the Columbia Teachers College and developed it. By 19 12, I think, Columbia Teachers College was training 50% of all administrators in the United States, and I think close to 20% of all the certified teachers. So, but setting up the colleges this way wasn't nearly enough. What these architects, let me call them, what these architects of forced schooling were concerned about was fine-tuning the German system so that it could adapt to American cultural mores, so there wouldn't be any flagrant confrontations. So the easiest way to do that was to take a United States Steel Company town in a very, very out-of-the-way location, Gary, Indiana. I mean, it's a town owned lock, stock, and barrel by the U.S. Steel Corporation, and to convert its schools first, and then fine-tune them and get them so they could deliver the standardized product that the industrialists wanted at the cheapest possible price. What they thought they could get away with is what they got away with in the mills, which is double shifts. So that in the Gary plant, not only was it the Prussian system, but the kids were run in and out of it in a morning shift and then an afternoon shift, and a whole different. So you got double your money out of your physical plant and your teaching staff. When that was considered to be perfected, using the tremendous political clout that Rockefeller and Carnegie had, it was forced onto New York City with no advanced debate at all. None of the instruments of democracy were pulled into play. One school year closed. When it opened 2 months, 3 months later, it was the Gary plan. Well, it was the Gary plan. Fortunately, a large contingent of German Jewish mothers who had fled Germany with their kids because they saw that the new schooling institution was about dumbing down their kids. They knew what was going on. They recognized it immediately, and they rioted in the streets. Whatever else people associate with Jewish culture in the United States, street rioting isn't a part of it. And yet they shut the schools of New York City down in 1917. And such a black eye was administered that the mayor, who was the leading candidate for, I don't know whether the Republican or Democratic nomination for president, was forced out of office, which ended his political career. He went to Europe as a pilot in the First World War, and he was shot down and killed. So that's just an interesting little tail onto the story. So now what happened is the Gary plan is balked in New York City, but only for a time. The routine used by sophisticated political architects is, if they can't ram something through by main force, they pull back and wait for a convenient future moment. They keep coming back again and again until by the 1930s we de facto had the Gary plan in New York City schools. We only had the split shift in ghetto schools, but essentially we had the dumbed down curriculum of the Prussian design. We had the dumbed-down routines, the bells at 40-minute intervals, which were taken straight from Pavlov's experiments with rats. That's the reason we have bells and buzzers and horns. You're conditioning the population to respond viscerally, as you condition a rat to do the same thing. I mean, it's just fascinating. Once you start to wallow in this stuff, it becomes clearer and clearer how, well, I was about to say cynical, but that would imply that the people were looking for venal advantages for themselves, and they were, in fact, utopian thinkers. I mean, Rockefeller and Carnegie and Astor and Harriman, they had all their material wants cared for as far into the future as the family was going to exist. What's the reason for getting up in the morning when you have these titanic resources and powers? Seems to me you have to have an ambition that matches them. So the ambition, as the Rockefeller Foundation announced in 1926, the trouble is, announcement doesn't mean they stood with loudspeakers in Times Square. It means that in their house publications and relationships with other powerful people, they announced that their master project was the control of human behavior. That is, the absolute control of human behavior. Not exactly something that you can find in the founding documents, right?
Right.
But once again, our biggest enemy is ourselves. We have a population, and including all the intelligent people, who have been conditioned to actually read this stuff, to see it, and to ignore it as if it didn't happen at all.
Well, you know, that's part of the Hegelian dialectic, I suppose. So why don't we start talking about Hegel?
Well, of course, by the end of the First World War, every single American university that had any reputation was headed by a graduate of a Prussian university. That's how these few specialized German names that everyone's, partially familiar with, that's how they spread north, south, east, and west. Every government agency was headed by a graduate of a Prussian university, or one from Saxony, or one from Hanover. And this process had started in 1814 with a guy who was eventually to be the governor of Massachusetts. I think his name was William Walker, but don't hold me to that. He went, and then more and more sons of prominent families went. And by the end of the Civil War, it was a flood that continued right up to the time of the First World War. Germany was the intellectual high command of the planet, and the prestige that came with the German PhD. Oddly enough, and you'll never meet anyone who knows this, there were only PhD degrees in Prussia and a few of the North German states. You couldn't get one of those in the United States, so you had to go to Prussia to get one. But once the contingent coming back was in charge of enough government agencies and enough universities, then all of them scrambled to get aboard, all the known ones. I mean, the ones with the glittering reputations. Hegel fascinated the people who no, I don't want to use lusted because that would be loading the deck. People whose ambition was to rule the world because they were bored with everything else, we could buy it. They were fascinated by Hegel because Hegel taught by the middle of the 19th century that you could take control of human history by provoking crises. Now, that's more important than those two simple words sound, because our 20th century history has been one in which we flared into war, expensive war, because we had been provoked by some military incursion or not. You only have to know Hegel and the influence he had on Germany. Germany provoked the invasion of Poland by murdering its own border guards and dressing some Germans up as Poles, and then saying this is an outrage, we're going to invade Poland. Two naval commissions, U.S. naval commissions, have exonerated, the Spanish from having anything to do with blowing up the Maine. It was some drunk who fell asleep and let the boiler pressure build up, or attacking the American destroyers off Korea. I'm astonished. I have never met anyone who's aware of the fact that the High Command of the Navy said those attacks never took place. They were an illusion.
Right. Well, I think there has been some documentation of that that's come out in the last few years.
Yeah, but it's on the fringe. Right there on the fringe. I don't mean that the people on the fringe are fringe people. I mean to keep that out of the mainstream journalistic press. You say, I'm tired of these conspiracy theories. The truth is, there's a rather impressive case that the Japanese fleet did not sail from Tokyo Harbor without being tracked every inch of the way. And great efforts being made to provoke Japan into doing that so that we could easily get out of the Depression establish bases in the Far East B. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence has accumulated. And several books, they're diffident, they're a little shy in pushing it to its conclusion, but they do raise this troubling thing that the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was no surprise. Anyway, so let's get back to Hegel. If you are a devotee of Hegel, you're not doing this for your personal advantage. You're doing this because you consider your own group to be either biologically or politically or psychologically or whatever so superior that it's your right to take charge of human affairs. Now, you got to get rid of the people who would disagree with you. So you provoke war with them by staging a crisis, and then you shut up the dissidents in your own population. We saw it under, this is disloyal, this is traitorous to raise any kind of criticism of attacking Iraq. Good God, this stuff's been around for 150 years. It's what is taught in seminar courses at Yale and Princeton and Stanford and the University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins, and to run into people, perfectly intelligent people, to whom this sounds like science fiction, is just to, well, in my case, maybe it's because I'm so old, it's just to get drowned in despair as if you're talking to children in a crib who've had no experience, who've done no reading, are unaware. Well, it's not going to help us much now, though, to point fingers. This country is in terrible, terrible shape. We lock up 6 times as many of our citizens as China does. I would say that ought to be headlines. On a monthly basis. Why is that happening? Why is that happening? We don't have a 10% unemployment. The current issue of Atlantic Monthly has a major article saying the joblessness will not recover. There may be a dramatic jump engineered so that the political trouble, but that in fact we're going to permanently run a high unemployment. Right now they say if you count underemployment, where people are just, shoveling snow or something in order to buy food, they say the unemployment right now is 17.5%. But among men between the ages of 25 and 54, it's 20% and bursting out on the upside. We're talking about a number that when I was a boy was considered the precursor to a violent revolution. And yet the Atlantic Monthly says that the psychological effects of long unemployment, it's a catastrophe. The psychological effects are sexual dysfunction, the breakup of marriages or the marriages being hostile associations of husband and wife that are never going to heal, that among kids who graduate into a depressed economy, there is no way for them ever to catch up with kids who graduate into a boom economy. They said the penalty, inflation adjusted, is at least $100,000 tax on these people. That the people who graduate into a depressed economy lose ambition, they cling on to their job like school teachers do, and abandon all principle. They'll do anything you tell them to do. We are in some mess, and nobody knows the way out of this thing. I think we're going to have to go through much worse and reconstitute. I don't know if it's possible, but the political system has to be reconstituted. And that does not mean that it has to be turned over to Republicans. And as far as the group that calls itself conservative, I was one of the founders of the New York State Conservative Party. I left, and I was an officer of the party. I left after 20 years because nobody I met I thought a sane person would call conservative. They were loonies, wild-eyed radicals, opportunists.
John, I mentioned yesterday that I wrote an article about the definition of conservative, just like the definition of liberal, and the word,
I asked you to send me a copy of that.
And the word conservative has been twisted as bad or worse as liberal has.
Yeah, both of them. In fact, the Bush family are classic textbook liberals. Classic textbook liberals.
Well, liberal in the traditional sense, liberal means of or befitting the free and for representational forms of government, and liberal.
Well, I'll accept that as an alternative definition, but the liberals were people free of any binding obligations or principles. They were liberated. They were able to make it up as they went along. And there's nothing actually wrong with that. It's just when it becomes a pervasive economic philosophy that you can't trust a liberal because they're liberated from keeping their promises too. They're liberated from it.
I don't know about that, because usually it has to deal with high integrity, whereas a conservative is a preservative, but typically they're only conservative.
What I'm suggesting is there are a variety of definitions, but the classic definition of liberal, which comes from the British global market, those were the first consistent liberal governments that weren't murdered by their citizens, and they exploited their own citizens in order to build global trade. They exploited the people they concluded alliances with whenever it became convenient to do so. They were liberated from the kind of things that held conventional people back. So economic liberals, and the term exists in the late 18th century. I mean, it probably exists throughout history in one form or another, but it came about to describe the people who were pouring a fortune into Great Britain because they were playing by their own rules, and the people they dealt with were playing by rather hidebound rules, traditional rules, religious rules, whatever. Anyway, Adam Smith really warrants being revisited several times through one's life, and I don't mean what secondary writings about Adam Smith. I'm talking about Reed Smith. He's wonderfully candid. He says before the 15th page in the book that there's no difference between the children of the farm serf and the children of the duke. I could have kissed him for saying that. He said, except the early training. Now, I said to David Bose of the Cato Institute, I said, David, you can't pick and choose from Adam Smith. If you're going to tell me Adam Smith is a secular saint, then actually read what he said. Smith said that if you gave educational schooling, that's his exact phrase, to ordinary people, the whole social order would be turned on its head. And lots of unlikely people would become the bosses, and lots of even unlikelier people would become the clerks and the serfs. That's, you only have to read the first 15 pages. I've never encountered anyone who claimed to be, a fan of Adam Smith who seems to have bothered to read that. But he's quite clear.
Well, it's funny that you should bring up Smith, because I was doing an interview last night with Stephen Zerlinga from the American Monetary Institute, and he was wanting to speak with you. So,
I shall be glad to.
Okay, I will. I'll send him your contact information. Let me ask you about Kant. We haven't covered Kant yet.
Emmanuel. The professor, he's the head of the philosophy department at the University of Berlin, and I understand from philosophically sophisticated people, and which I would hardly claim to be one of, but I understand that Kant stands right with Plato as one of the two most influential philosophers in history. I guess Hegel would make a triumvirate, because in the last couple of 100 years, it seems to me that Hegel has been the master. Remember, if I could be allowed to just finish your earlier question about Hegel. Hegel said that you could actually bring human history, not human life, but human history to a close. He said, if the last argument is argued out, history will freeze and never change again, and the people at the top will remain at the top forever. Well, this intrigued an awful lot of big shot industrialists who said, well, you know, one way is to follow Hegel's suggestion that you just let all these wars and arguments be argued, and eventually there won't be anything, they'll all be settled. But another way is to remove the brain core from most people so they're incapable of arguing. What they consider argument is actually just whining and complaining. They can't formulate nor sustain an argument. So here is certainly another piece of the foundation of institutional schooling. You know, you make nice, right? There's no arguments in textbooks because everything is settled. No one ever bothers to say, well, this is one way to look at it, but here's an entirely different way to look. You don't do that. In Jesuit boarding schools where I went, you do that as early as third grade, but in public schools, including the gifted and you don't do that. So the ability to argue is gone, and that makes it so much easier for management. And also, although this is a trifle cynical, so much easier for the architects bringing this about because they're already pretty well placed. And now, if Hegel's correct, they'll remain well placed. And so we're talking about Immanuel Kant now. I mean, Kant is a titanic thinker. His four major books, the two best known are Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Practical Reason. But the two other influential ones, whose titles skip me now, he translates very, very badly to start with. So you've really got to grit your teeth and put yourself in a little society of like-minded people to be able to extract much from Kant. But Kant is the only major philosopher who ever put forth a creditable argument for the existence of God. It's just fascinating. Maybe one reason, he doesn't occur very often in American universities because he's anathema to the secular crowd. Kant's disciple, who inherited his chair at the University of Berlin, was the ever-popular creator of the Addresses to the German Nation, which gave us the template for our schooling. And we talked about him yesterday. So Kant's interesting because he more or less stands astride the years when the new United States was coming into being and finding his feet. He was apparently well known to our so-called founding fathers, as was Spinoza. But Johann Fichte was his heir. And the University of Berlin wasn't, it's very misleading to try to compare the university scene now to the one that existed then. We pay deference and lip service to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, but actually their relative position in the university pantheon is much diminished, whereas the University of Berlin essentially stood alone astride the university world globally. It was where you took your final appeal to what was going on there, and it was pretty much the first, not purely, but almost purely research university. Its stated alliance was with the Lords of the Economy and the Lords of Government. It did not exist to educate undergraduates. They were raw material to be chewed up, and a few of them resurrected. If you read Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published about 1620 or 30, Bacon creates this model of a research university that draws from all over the place the best people and produces intelligence, not for everybody, for the kings of the economy and the lords of the government. I would say that New Atlantis, which survives as a fragment, it's not even the whole thing, has got to be one of the 24 most influential documents in the history of mankind. Which, of course, is another reason why it isn't read or even heard about in schooling.
Right. Would you like to talk about group elasticity?
Oh, wow. We're talking there about a structural engineering term. If you want to protect your tall building against high winds, you want the building to be elastic so that it can, like the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building in New York. I'm dating myself, I know there are lots of taller ones, but it can sway 35 or 40 feet off its center, and its elasticity brings it back to the vertical again. When a building like that is about to collapse, what you see is plastic behavior. Once again, I'm borrowing these terms from structural engineering. That you see the thing go off its true, but it doesn't return. It doesn't collapse either. It comes partway back. And then the next Titanic gust of wind, it goes farther. And eventually, this plastic behavior leads it to a collapse. There's a famous film that I believe is on YouTube too, but I saw it. Excuse me, I took some courses in structural engineering. It's a bridge out of...
Today, John Taylor Gatto is back for this long-awaited Part 3 interview with me, and we'll be discussing the true definition of liberal, the CFR, Professor Carol Quigley, Professor Anthony Seton, Douglas Reed, Edward Bernays, Charlotte Iserbyt, the great books of the Western world, and the state of compulsory, probably the most famous school teacher in the world. 3 of my interview with John Taylor Gatto. Enjoy.
Okay, ready.
All right. You and I have talked about my definition of liberal article. I had done done some research on the definition of liberal and how they've twisted the word liberal around to hide what it really means, and found some interesting stuff there. But you and I had talked about that before, and I was going to send you that as well, so I'll make sure...
I'd appreciate reading that. I always berate my wife, and she's...
Well, see, the word liberal is tied directly to the 7 liberal arts, and the word liberal was originally tied directly to the word freedom. And in fact,
you weren't allowed to study the 7 liberal arts until, if you were a slave in Roman times, it was as soon as you acquired freedom, that was when you began your 7 liberal arts education. So, and then the word liberal is directly tied to liber, which is Latin for book. So liber, book, and freedom are synonymous. So the freedom is in the books. So basically what they would do is, as soon as the slaves got free, they would study grammar, logic, rhetoric, math, geometry, music, and astronomy, and then they became
the trivium and the quadrivium.
Exactly, and then they were considered free, and then this is where the word liberal comes from. So what they did was they actually spun the word liberal backward to mean the antithesis of what it really is.
Yes. Well, Orwell, in 1984, when he talks about newspeak, really picked the idea up from the drawing room conversations of the Fabian socialists in England, the high-powered intellectual branch of the tribe, who talked about stripping the opposition of its strength by taking its concepts and redefining them to mean something else, so that the innocent public was utterly confused, and your enemies were lost because they couldn't talk with the terminology they had painstakingly developed.
John, why don't I have you, for those who don't know who you are and didn't hear my first 2 interviews with you, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, what your background is, that sort of thing?
Okay, I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and location is very, very much a part of who I am, even though I haven't been there to live for decades. I'm a product of a very, very diverse set of immigrant cultures brought in to work the coal mines and the steel mills in the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th. So my experience had been that among these newcomers to America who actually wanted to be here, that there was an intense interest in ideas and in debate, conversation. I was, of course, schooled in the public schools there, but we were the coal miners' kids and the steelworkers' kids. We were reading the Greeks and the Romans in translation in 6th grade and 7th grade, and we got to read some of them in Latin by 9th grade. So when I came east to the coast, which is where the inroads of this New World Order were strongest, I was shocked to discover that what was common discourse in the 1940s in elementary school was reserved for elite kids in secondary school in New York City. To say I was shocked hardly describes the way I felt. I was bewildered. I was baffled. And it's taken decades. I taught for 30 years in the public schools of New York City, and my own background was the public schools of Western Pennsylvania, with a little bit of time spent in a Jesuit boarding school when I was quite young. And there in 3rd grade, which is the year I spent, we easily were mastering an intellectual diet that didn't occur in New York City until high school, and if then. So I taught for 30 years, and very, very quickly, because of my background, not because of any ideology I possessed, but because of my background, I scrapped what I was ordered to do, and without realizing it, sabotaged the official curriculum of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a very, very wealthy area, but I sabotaged it big time because I had been taught and believed implicitly that there were very few human distinctions in intellect, that people from any walk of life were capable of mastering the most difficult ideas, and first they had to be offered the option to do that. Only recently, and I mean last 10 years, I discovered that the father of capitalism, so-called, Adam Smith, had written the identical thing in the first 20 pages of Wealth of Nations. He said there's no difference between the coal miner's kid or the peasant's kid.
So what you're saying is that, John, is that as these elitists claim that there's no genetic difference, there's no genetic predisposition to be smarter or whatever, what it really comes down to is the education and being, whether or not they were indoctrinated in a school or whether or not they were given something like a foundation in the 7 liberal arts growing up, with critical thinking and those things. And that's the defining issue, though, and it has nothing to do with all of this other stuff that they parade in front of us.
Oh, the endless research-driven studies, that maintain an apparatus of teacher colleges and billions of dollars and hours of time wasted every year. It's utter nonsense. And to discover that Adam Smith, and subsequently have discovered that a great many people understood this, but that Adam Smith had hit upon that while he was also hitting upon the mechanism to make a nation wealthy, reassured me that I wasn't flying, on some cloud dream. And then I put it into practice, and it worked. Got me into a huge amount of difficulty because my very ordinary ghetto kids would consistently outstrip the gifted and talented kids in intellectual competition.
Gifted and talented, quote unquote, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, quote unquote. If anything is
more affluent, I think, is a better word for it.
Okay, I'm willing, but usually I talk to audiences who, have that vocabulary unchallenged. So, but really, it upsets the school hierarchy, who are, after all, from bottom to top, only flunkies. They're not given any latitude to redefine what they're ordered to do. No latitude at all. So they're all order takers. They're all clerks. From the teacher's aide to the district superintendents, they're all clerks. And parents waste enormous amounts of energy because in an innocent, simple-minded fashion, they assume they can plead with these people. And, of course, occasionally you find a saboteur, as I was, unwittingly, but still a saboteur who's willing to independently alter a set of orders, custom tailor them to the kid, because those people don't last long.
Last year, when you were on the show, at the end of our second interview, you had said that you wanted to go into great depth with me sometime on the Council on Foreign Relations. And so I wanted to give you the floor here for a while and have you tell us all you know about the Council on Foreign Relations.
It's one of a historical succession of transnational organizations that have an agenda quite unlike what we'd call human nature agendas. It's a latter-day development and probably the most efficient, where you not only take insiders who are in on the game, but you draw in a cordon of rather innocent outsiders, but well-placed, who you then recruit indirectly into the project. So in simple terms, the project is to create a global government. But the more profound part is why this should be thought necessary, simply by black and white literary motivations of good and evil or religious things. You can come at an approximation, but these people, from their beginnings, and it's really difficult to know how long ago these ideas were distilled, but you can find them actively at work in the 18th century. And ever since, the Council on Foreign Relations emerges, I believe, in the 1920s, but early in the 20th century, as the linkage among Western nations. There's a counterpart among Asian nations known as the Institute of Pacific Relations. And I came upon this knowledge not from conspiracy literature, but from accidentally stumbling on two congressional investigations, which the public is utterly unaware of, major investigations of where on earth this strange school institution came from and who was directing it. And I believe the second one was 1959, the Reese Commission, sabotaged by powerful elements in the American establishment, like the New York Times, sabotaged after it was clear that these congressional investigators were crackerjacks at turning up anomalies and contradictions in what was going on. But both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Institute of Pacific Relations were fingered in these Reese investigations as the major source of curriculum decisions. And then these were filtered through about a dozen private corporate foundations like the Carnegie Corporation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, which apparently had been assigned specialized tasks to bring about through, tinkering with the school machine. The Ford Foundation, for example, and this figures in the outbreaks of chaos in schools during the 1960s. The Ford Foundation was assigned the task of breaking the influence of traditional moralities and definitions of justice on the next generation coming up. And one of the ways that was done, and if some of your listeners are old enough, they may remember this, is taking perfectly outraged and correct charges of horrible practices that were going on in the schools, like the school I worked in the middle of the gold zone of the west side of Manhattan, was probably not only the major drug drop in that part of New York City, but in fact, kids would openly wander through the halls with bottles of whiskey and attempt to sell a shot to teachers on lunch hour and things like that. And this was not checked in any way. In fact, the people who attempted to intervene in some way in this weird moral breakdown were treated savagely and hounded in some cases out of the business. So that was the Ford Foundation's doing, and I recall, this should tickle some of your listeners, I recall that by the late 1960s, they had forced on New York City public schools a set of informal regulations that demanded that any charge you brought against a kid, for example, if you found him fornicating in a coat closet, would have to be brought up formally, and the kid was allowed to produce witnesses, and there was testimony and some kind of kangaroo court. There was an appeals procedure. So anyone familiar with the way a big, dense public school with a lot of different cultures makes and it works is you might have a dozen of these incidents every day, and the paperwork involved to attempt to correct them was so onerous that nobody tried, and that partially accounts for the incredible turnover among the teaching staff, not only then but now. So each foundation had specific instructions of how its own work would add up to advancing the great project.
So with the Council on Foreign Relations, who are some of the key players that were putting this forward?
Well, I would say that unquestionably where the activities, I mean, these organizations operated in every institution, but where they operated in schools, the key players were clearly the Ford people, the Rockefeller people, and greatest of all were the Carnegie people. When a recent president surrounded himself with Carnegie Foundation cabinet members, the hair stood up on my head. And obviously, most of the major politicians we have aren't principals in this game. They're patsies like district superintendents or the political leaders of state school committees.
Now, have you ever gone into the CFR archives to see if you can find specifically who was involved and what they said and did? I have not
personally done that because those archives are not available. They were only made available in toto to one human being, and he was, fortunately, a world-class scholar.
Well, no, you can today, John. Today, you can actually call up the Princeton University Mudd Library there in Pennsylvania, and you can order Council on Foreign Relations documents directly from the archives there.
Well, thank you for telling me that, and not that meticulous scholarship wouldn't do that and wouldn't discover other things, but Quigley uncovered enough because he was at the time the only one ever offered unlimited access to the files, that his 1,300-page masterpiece, Tragedy and Hope, lays out enough in minute detail that certainly for one lifetime to absorb that this is not a sloppy project, and it involves all the significant wars of the past century are part of the undertaking. As Quigley explained it, and the beauty is that he has this major league mind, recognized as such. He was the head of the Foreign Service Department at Georgetown. The idea was to back any kind of aggression that occurred around the planet, and the utilitarian aspect of that was that an aggressor would break down the different cultures inside the aggressive country, and then it would break down the cultures and the principled sources in neighboring countries. At that point, the English-speaking cabal could step in and crush that nation. Hitler got wind of this. That's why the heroic British troops at Dunkirk were allowed to escape. Hitler was sending a signal that he understood he wanted to be dealt in. But they didn't want a paper hanger's son or some peasant involved in this thing.
Have you ever looked into the Professor Carroll Quigley papers? Do you know if they're stored at Georgetown or where they're at?
They're stored at Georgetown, and there is, although I haven't been, closely involved with this for at least a decade, but there is a magnificent audio tape available, I believe, from the Quigley storage at Georgetown, in which Quigley talks for an hour about his fear that he is under some threat. At several occasions during the monologue on the tape, he shuts the tape recorder off to speak to the interviewer because he doesn't want anyone to overhear what he's about to say. And one of the things he says that should chill your blood is that I believe it was Macmillan published Tragedy and Hope in, I believe, 1963. The book sold out immediately. And when Quigley asked when it was going to be reprinted, Macmillan told him that there was so little interest in the book, even though they had thousands of orders, back orders for the reprint, that they had destroyed the plates and it wasn't going to be reprinted. I only hit on the thing, and I am not part of a network of conspiracy theorists around the country, but I started to look in major city libraries because I travel constantly for a copy of Tragedy of Hope, and in every library, I must have looked in 8 cities, the single copy the library owned had been stolen, or they assumed it had been stolen because it was gone from the collection.
Well, I remember you said that you had gone from Dallas to San Francisco to several other libraries, right?
In New York. I eventually ended up with 2 copies. One, I hate to go on tape saying this, but one temporarily stolen from the rare book room in New York University. That one was returned when I got a call from a book bootlegger on the West Coast who had heard I was looking for a copy, and he had illicitly reprinted the book. I believe that's been done half a dozen times, so that I understand that Macmillan has a reprint out now, which it purports is the original. I have not had the time to sit down with the bootleg copy, which is the original, and the new Macmillan copy, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it had been vetted strategically, because the information is just hair-curling in the book, nor is Quigley the kind of person like other respectable but somewhat fringe people who have picked up that something's going on. I mean, Quigley's a major international scholar, and his thinking is just impeccable and first class. But you'll find such things in the original Tragedy and Hope, which I would hope recur in the reprint, that at no time was there any menace to the Western armies from Germany. That is to say, Germany didn't have the industrial capacity to replace its losses. So that Britain started the war with a larger, more modern air force. I know we don't hear this. Germany had, and it could replace its losses. Japan was the odd man out. It couldn't even modify the equipment it started the war with, so that as each month passed, it was hopelessly behind. But there was never any question, that the war itself was part of this colossal project, brilliantly conceived, to eliminate older forms of moral thinking and replace them with what I think we could fairly call pragmatism of the sort that came out of Harvard around 1900 from Charles S. Peirce, it's pronounced, or John Dewey, or Oliver Wendell Holmes. Our great Supreme Court justice is on record at the turn of the century saying no such thing as justice exists or truth. It's whatever the strongest people say it is, and no sane jurist will not decide a case before it's argued. How about that? This is Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great autocrat of the breakfast table, who will not decide a case if it's significant before the case is argued on the basis of what will add to social stability and the stability of the social and economic hierarchy. We're dealing with a caliber of mentality and sophistication about human nature and all the great philosophical questions that's extremely uncommon and never encountered publicly today, although it exists, surely.
What about Anthony Sutton? Do you have anything to say on his work?
Sutton I knew briefly, and he's probably the great exception to the ease with which conspiracy theorists can be marginalized by the establishment. I mean, Sutton is a legitimate first-class scholar from a legitimate university. I mean, I'm not expressing my own.
He was at Princeton
system, but
John, do you hear me?
Pardon
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was trying to interject there. I said he was at Stanford University at the Hoover Institute.
Yeah, right. So Sutton could not be dismissed, and his books about Wall Street's decisive impact on the survival of the Soviet Union and Wall Street's decisive impact on the rise of the Nazi Party, are very, very difficult to say, oh, well, that's just some nut talking, because he has he has the tools of a first-class scholar and access to documents that aren't readily available. There was a reason why Adolf Hitler's right-hand man, Putzi Hanfstaengl, a Harvard graduate, was both the house guest of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the house guest of Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, these strange little anomalies aren't just local color to say, my, isn't that interesting? You know, the Germanic mind is the dominant mind in the United States. Half of our citizenry is derived from Germany. The boundary between Canada and the United States is set by the King of Prussia. we have this long, virtually unremarked by standard references, history of Prussian influence on the United States, and our schools are just an off-print from the Prussian template. I mean, they're modified to conceal that, but not modified very well. The bells in school are directly taken from the reflex arc bells that got a dog to salivate in Pavlov's experiments in, I believe, the 1870s, but don't hold me to that year. Right. But that's why we get the bell schedule. The way to neutralize mental development has been understood throughout human history. And it's fairly easy to do. And the truth is that over a pitcher of beer, probably some frat boys could figure out most of how to do the thing. You can't manage educated people very well because the mark of education is you self-manage. So that to allow the secrets of the trivium and the quadrivium to get around too far, the lost tools of learning, as Dorothy Sayles calls them, is to usher in a kind of society that's hinted at in the founding documents of the country, but nobody in a position of influence in their right mind really would allow that to happen. And if someone emerged from that social status who was hot to trot on honoring equal opportunity and liberty, you can be sure they would be quickly marginalized. Look at the current presidency. Now, based on, and I'm not really going to talk politically here, but based on the really great command of spoken language that Mr. Obama has, and based on the change you can believe in, yes we can, stirring campaign, certainly a lot of the young people who elected him would have expected Noam Chomsky or who's the mayor of Oakland now, but the former governor of California.
Oh, you're talking about Brown?
They would have expected a sprinkling of those people, at least in cabinet positions. Instead, we got the Goldman Sachs crowd and the Carnegie Corporation crowd. Now, I don't have the time or even the interest to push much farther to figure out how that happened, but I do know that it's as plain as the nose on your face that there's no change you can believe in, and no, you can't. There's no room for argument. and nor was there in the last presidency or the one before the one before.
Well, have you? Can you hear me? Can you hear me at all, John? Okay. Every time I go to ask you a question, you don't hear me. So
it's because to talk clearly to you, I have to pull this phone away from. I really ought to get one of those earphone things. I apologize.
All right. Well, I think you were talking about Jerry Brown, that was the governor of California. Is that who you meant?
Yeah. No, I'm. By the way, I'm not an advocate here or a critic. I'm simply.
Well, you know, I actually met him once, and let me just say that he is one of the worst individuals that I have ever met in person.
Okay, and that doesn't surprise me. And what I meant to say was, I'm not an advocate when I say that there is a sharp inconsistency with the campaign run by the current president and who he then surrounded himself with.
Right.
So that if you're taught to look at anomalies not as accidents, but as revelatory of the actual agenda that you're in the presence of, it's obvious that the agenda suggested by the campaign, but I'm not a partisan either way here. In fact, I think there is no solution through politics on a national level. No solution possible. There is no difference among the parties. They're the same people. They take money to run their campaigns from the same places.
You're exactly right, John. And not only that, but it's obviously a Hegelian dialectic. But if people had the trivium, that whole system wouldn't work.
No, it wouldn't work because very early on, a lot of people would catch on. And they would say, get out of here. I mean, who's here are you pulling? Yeah, you're right.
Right. Let me ask you, John, have you ever read Douglas Reed's books?
I have not, and I don't recognize the reference. I apologize.
Okay, well, I'll send you, I guess that'll be tricky. Maybe Rich can give you a copy on disc or something when you're at his place next week. But he's got a book that really ties in all of the missing pieces between Professor Carroll Quigley and Professor Anthony Sutton.
I see. I would be fascinated. By the way, when you say next week, is that Santa Fe?
No, that's Connecticut with Richard Andrew
Grove. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's...
He's a partner of mine. We work together. So...
Yeah, no, I would be fascinated, and... Each place I travel, it turns out that there's a kind of fraternity of people on to at least a part of the game.
Well, yeah, and this guy Douglas Reed, he's a big part of the game. I mean, it's as big a piece of the puzzle as Professor Carroll Quigley or Anthony Sutton is. Let me ask you about Charlotte Iserbyt. What do you think about her work?
I have to be very candid, and I don't mean to be dismissive, but that kind of argumentation, which tends toward, rabid denunciation and demonization of people, does not serve the cause of truth well. It's so easy to dismiss, and this will sound elitist. I don't mean it. Charlotte's command of grammar and syntax is not the best. I mean, she's clearly an intelligent.
She didn't know what the trivium was when I mentioned it to her.
Okay. So Charlotte's book, I think, was strongly motivated by her anger at what she saw and suspected was happening, and she threw together a lot of information, some of it accurate, some of it crazy. She threw it together in a crazy fashion, and it's precisely the kind of document that can be used to dismiss someone impressive like Quigley. Furthermore, when I spoke in Maine, this must be 10 years ago, near Charlotte's home, my hosts at the Home Building Institute up in Bath informed me that Charlotte had told them that I was part of the conspiracy, which I didn't take any onus.
I talked to her on the
wackiness.
I talked to her on the phone once to try to get her to come on my show, which she actually refused the interview with me, but I was able to talk to her for maybe an hour and a half on the phone, and she told me on the phone that she thought that you were a part of the conspiracy, and that
good. It was that recently?
It was maybe 6 or 8 months ago.
Okay, well then at least Charlotte's consistent, because this was a good 10 years ago.
Well, there you go. Well, and she didn't present any evidence, and which would be arguing the arbitrary, which is a fallacy, and you just dismiss it. So that's why having the trivium is so important, correct?
Sure. And of course, it's alive and well. It's just not alive enough and well enough, but it's not likely.
So John, let me ask you point blank then, are you a part of the conspiracy?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I may be being used by... These are brilliantly sophisticated minds.
John, are you a tool for the Fabian socialists?
No, but I must tell you that I have a close friend who used to be a student of mine, who founded a famous poetry institute in New York City. Famous. The Japanese government would send students over to see what the fuss was about in poetry. And he called me once, 4 or 5 years ago, and said that he was thrilled that the Council on Foreign Relations had invited him to attend a series of planning meetings. And what did I think about that? And I had no hesitation in saying, this is a standard tactic. You will be a source of information about how the other side is thinking, so that they can sharpen their responses. That was the job taken by, and wait a second, I'm quoting Quigley here. I think it was Rockefeller assumed the task, or maybe J.P. Morgan, yes, assumed the task of infiltrating every dissident organization of substance in the world and pumping funds into this organization so it wouldn't die out, because it would be an impeccable source of inside information that couldn't be attained any other way. When I was a freshman at Cornell, and extremely innocent, long ago, my roommate was the son of a New York State Supreme Court justice, much more sophisticated than I, and he informed me that there was no American Communist Party, that all of the subscriptions to the Daily Worker were taken by different government departments in order to keep this feeble spark of a Communist Party alive. There were 13,000 subscriptions. He said 12,500 of them were taken by different government agencies, had dummy mail drops, or otherwise it would go out, and I was dumbfounded. I said, well, why wouldn't they let it go out? Because they want to know how these people are thinking there. now, in my dotage, I can understand the brilliance of that.
Last time you were on the show, you talked about Edward Bernays for a little while. I wanted you to discuss him again and what you found regarding him and Adolf Hitler, where you found that information. But, give us a detailed discussion of Edward Bernays, the author of Propaganda.
Well, fortunately, I've lifelong been a promiscuous reader, so that if you leave me in a public library or in the Columbia stacks under the bowels of the earth, I can't bear to actually focus on the desk. I'm picking up books at random. And through this helter-skelter fishing expedition approach, I came slowly to see that a great many of the bewildering occurrences and anomalies that I encountered were connected. For example, let me give you a specific example, and then I'll get to Bernays. I knew that the American adoption laws that wipe out the historical identity of the child being transferred were, an affront to common morality and decency. And by reading, I discovered that the British upper classes had a great debate whether to allow this bizarre legislation to be part of Britain because important speakers said it made no sense to do this. But the argument that won the day in Britain was that this would create an endless amount of business for lawyers, and therefore simply on practical grounds that you have to keep the upper class green, it was taken in. I know that substitute child care through human history has been a part of every society, and yet why would someone very late in history decide to wipe out the historical identity of these people? And then poking around, I discovered that Sweden had virtually eliminated adoption, even though next to the United States, in the middle 60s, it was the world's leading adoption nation. And I corresponded for a while with the head of Swedish adoption, and she said, we discovered that the pathologies, and they had nothing to do with, morality or decency, that the pathologies that follow transferring, the identity of a child to a family that it has no connection with were so great and so expensive for the state that we simply went to women who were likely to surrender their kid, and we said, look, if you keep your kid, we'll surround you with a support network. And well, if you fall down, we'll pick you up. And it vanished. It went from 1 year, number 2 in the world, to 2 years later, it virtually didn't exist in Sweden. So I was very, very interested in how it had come to the United States. And in the course of hunting around, I discovered that the very same people who had created America's school institution, or many of those people, were also big-time members of the campaign to bring legal adoption to the United States. That's the kind of anomaly. So, in order to discover how advertising and public relations had grown so swiftly into a profession in the United States. I was indiscriminately reading left and right, and I hit upon Edward L. Bernays and a fellow named Ivy Lee, who had improved on the idea of advertising, that they would approach mental colonization of the subjects they wanted to influence from a lot of different angles, and it wouldn't appear there was any commercial, in well-done public life, there was any commercial push behind the thing. And in the course of reading about Bernays, I discovered first, my teeth almost fell out, that he was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Okay, now I saw how his brain began to think that way. And then I learned that he had been Hitler's public relations account in the rise of the Nazi Party. So this tells me, one, that the amorality of public relations and of advertising, at least the kind that, creative, let's call it, the amorality of it was deep in the cells of Mr. Bernays. I mean, business is business, right? And in the course of reading about that, I discovered his connection to the great pragmatic revolution at Harvard in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where people like Oliver Wendell Holmes said, there is no such thing as morality or truth. Whatever the strongest people want it to be is what is. And I could see that the strongest people were able to pay Mr. Bernays to teach, for example, American women to smoke. That, I think, is one of his, if I said greatest triumphs, I hope you hear the irony in my voice. But he worked out principles of mental influence that the great American journalist Walter Lippmann also worked out. In fact, Bernays, Lippmann, and there's one other name that eludes me now, during the 1920s, published a series of books. Oh, I know who I'm thinking of, but I can't get his name. The inventor of Children's Court. He was.
I don't remember the name of that.
What? Do you know his name?
I don't remember the name of that.
Yeah, those three published a series of books read heavily in the higher levels of, the American intelligentsia, which distilled principles of illusion that would cause the public to either drop its opposition or to sign on to things that otherwise...
John, let me read everyone the very first paragraph from Bernays' book, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right, this is the very first paragraph from Chapter 1, and I believe this is page 1. The numbers actually might be a little bit off. Let me see. Well, actually, it's Chapter 1, page 37. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical, he claims, result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society.
Well, that brilliant opening, it really can't be misinterpreted, can it? And that comes directly from Charles Darwin's first cousin, Galton, Francis Galton, who spread Darwin's mechanism of natural selection into the leadership of all institutions in society. He went around, I mean, it was his life's work to spread mechanisms to make sure natural selection allowed the biologically best people to control all institutions. Without Galton, there's no doubt in my mind we would not have institutional schooling as we have it now. He mathematized the thing, research-driven insights, because he knew and boasted about knowing that ordinary people are frightened by numbers, and that if you just pile numbers upon numbers, eventually they surrender, froth at the mouth. All of the things we're talking about, Bernays and Galton, the whole pack of this is distilled in 1984. It's not a novel at all. It's Orwell's representation of what he heard directly at the high-level cocktail parties and in the drawing rooms of London, which has fallen under the spell of the Fabians. What's the symbol of the Fabian party? It's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
What about the great books of the Western world? What can you tell us about them?
Well, they've been as ruthlessly marginalized, I think, as almost as possible to be. I think the latest slur in the last decade was, we don't need books written by dead white men. I'm sure you've heard that.